calling on the Prime Minister, hear, hear.
Thank you very much. I'll take POIs in the chat, please. Corporate tax is particularly beneficial because it gives countries, access to a large pool of revenue that allows them to spend on really important things like infrastructure projects that allow people to access more of the city or allow more people to travel to remote areas. It allows them to build infrastructure like hospitals that's particularly important to keeping your population healthy. Obviously, this is difficult to engage with in the status quo, though, due to the prisoner's dilemma, which is that no one else wants to lower their raise their corporate tax for the risk of losing companies from their industry and worry about them going elsewhere. This is a particularly beneficial system, the BEPS 2.0, to all countries in the world. But what opening government is going to do to win this debate is explain how this particularly helps developing countries that will win us the round. 3 things in the speech. Firstly, on setup. Secondly, on why this helps increase the pool of lending in the world. And thirdly, on why this helps the economies of developing countries. Firstly, on setup. The first thing to note in setup is what are the interests of a developing country. We think that the biggest interest of a developing country is to simply grow their economy and to develop so they can have access to a higher quality of life for their citizens, so they can have access to more goods and services. I think that is the most proximate incentive because that informs how people vote and how people, feel like they're living their life. The second thing to explain in setup then is what the BEPS 2.0 is. This is a level of corporate tax rate that should be, uniform around these countries that participate in multilateral agreements. We think this is roughly to be about 12% because this is what Biden has discussed when discussing this policy, but it's probably, somewhere around there. And we think the people who are likely to adhere to this policy, as set out in the examples given in the info slide, are these large companies that are countries that are part of these large multilateral agreements, these big rich countries that are part of the G8, part of the G20, part of the OECD. We think that many countries are likely to accept instituting the BEPS into their into these multilateral agreements. One, because this motion supports the implementation of that. But secondly, the gains that they get from free trade far outweigh any marginal loss that they feel from maybe upsetting a few companies in their region, because the gains of free trade allow them to export to other countries with far lower tariff rates that makes them more competitive in those areas. They don't want to risk losing access to those privileged markets. But the third reason is that this is applied equally. So there isn't a change in competitive advantage. So even if the company is mildly more upset at having to pay a bit more tax, they know that doesn't actually change their ability to export into key markets, their ability to access their consumer base. Next then, are there any points of clarification? No, moving on then. Oh, yes.
Just checking, you intend that the vast majority of developing countries themselves also opt into this BEPS framework, right?
So the first benefit we're going to give you is not contingent on whether developing countries opt in or not. And the second benefit we'll give you is whether if they opt in, all the benefits they'll be able to achieve. We think we can win on either metric. Right, let's talk about why the access to the largest pool of lending is likely to increase for developing countries. This is particularly important for developing countries at the top of this point because lending allows them the ability to access a huge pool of capital that they do not have the access to gain through tax revenue that allows them to do the things that are particularly important to their development, like get funding to build large infrastructure projects that have been funded by the IMF and the World Bank, for example. Why do we think that the pool of lending is likely to increase when developed countries join into the BEPS 2.0 framework? That's simply because there will be more corporate tax in these rich countries that increases the pool of government money that these governments have to allocate to different parts. Why do we think this means that this will follow into lending? Firstly, these developed countries will need to borrow far less money because they have a greater pool of money to spend from their corporate tax. In the status quo, many of these trusted countries are stealing the pool of lending available to the global whole because they refuse to tax increase their companies that exist in their country. That's because they don't want to anger them. They have been captured by a lot of corporate lobbying, for example, in the United States. So instead, they just run their governments at a government deficit and continue to borrow more and more money to be able to fuel the social programs that they do in their country and raise the debt ceiling. They're able to do this and exploit this loophole because everyone don't trust them. The United States dollar, for example, is the most trusted currency in the world. So they're able to lend as much money or borrow as much money as they want, because no one will ever expect them to default on, and that allows them to continue to increase their debt ceiling and outcompete developing countries who do not have a similarly trusted amount of money. The change here is that these countries, one, need to borrow less money, but secondly, have more money to lend out because of this higher pool of revenue that trickles down into the IMF, trickles down into giving loans into these developing countries that can able to access a huge amount of infrastructure development that is particularly vital for them being able to develop in a whole. I'll take a POI from OO if they have one. Nope, CO.
Why wouldn't these developed countries just invest in some things domestically, like healthcare or paying down that massive debt that they have?
Yeah, so sure, they can do parts of that, but they don't need to pay down the massive debt because they know they could continue to lend more. And we think some of that definitely trickles down to lending. And even if it's only a small amount, that actually goes a really long way in developing countries where it doesn't actually cost that much to be able to do this type of infrastructure. Next then, let's talk about how this benefits developing countries' economies. Firstly, the corporate tax is particularly beneficial because of all this stuff I've already said about having revenue to spend, but also because now it pushes companies to be more expansionary. Because they've lost a subset of their revenue, they push to expand their markets. They create more factories in your area to be able to employ more people, to be able to increase that profit more. Both those types of things are really good for infrastructure and for employment in these areas. We think that corporate lobbying in developing countries, though, means that they're likely to have a lower corporate tax rate or give, tax exemptions to these companies. Joining the BEPS 2.0 means that they will have a flat corporate tax rate with other countries that are also in this multilateral agreement. For example, all of the countries in the African Union would have a similar tax rate that allows them all to massively increase the amount of government revenue they get. And we think that this is a much more secure way to get it because, firstly, it is out of the realm of domestic politics, which might be captured by corruption or might be captured by corporate lobbying and a race to the bottom type of effect. That means that people try, lower their corporate tax rate. But secondly, its cost to these companies is too high. The cost to leaving these multilateral agreements is too high so that they will accept the corporate tax rate. One, because people will be upset at the government when they don't have access to as many cheap goods and services anymore, but also companies get the benefit of being in the free trade area, access to that huge market. This is why everyone benefits, even if, no matter who joins the BEPS 2.0.
Thank you for that wonderful speech, Prime Minister. Now to open the case for opposition, calling on leader of OP, here.
Okay, so I'll just try to speak slowly, so maybe it's fine. If there's a lot of issue, please interrupt me. Okay. I will begin in 3. Wait, let's see, not my timer. I will begin in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, I just want to clarify the motion for this debate. It is this House as a developing country, so we have to debate this from the perspective of the developing country and their interests, and assuming what happens to the developing country if they opt into this framework and what happens if they don't. Necessarily, the burden on government was to exclusively benefit for developing countries in all instances to benefit by joining into this, and rather the sort of burden on opposition is to prove that even if on some instances it does not work for developing countries, necessarily this motion can fall, because at a point where the motion wording is general that all developing countries or like US developing countries should sort of opt into this, necessarily then we understand that if we can show that in some instances it's wrong or even most instances, then we win this debate. Panel, I am from a developing country, so let me really tell you exactly how this place works. Understand 2 things about developing countries is one, we are very resource strapped due to things like colonialism and slavery. A lot of resources have been looted and been taken away from our country, and we generally have a lack of funds right now. We have a lack of investment right now, and we are generally low in the country's foreign reserves. We are low in terms of our revenue in our treasury. But the second thing we must also know about this particular situation is because we are low in terms of revenue, we're looking for sources of revenue. There are different kinds of sources of revenue, but the most preferred one is FDI. Why? What are the 3 sources of revenue which you can probably talk about? First is like sort of increasing interest rates, but this causes inflation, so it's not preferable. Second one is what government talks about, which is lending and loans and getting loans from foreign entities like the IMF and the World Bank. But this is inherently much more harmful because one, these IMF and World Bank institutions generally are sort of cater to the West and like create biased loans and like biased interest rates against the developing countries because they're used as tools for the West to keep all of them in line. But also the fact where these sorts of institutions don't give loans just like that. They give loans with a lot of collateral agreements and also a lot of interest involved. Means that these countries, which are like sort of having a low amount of resources necessarily, are not going to be able to pay back loans very easily. It'll be difficult. It'll not be impossible. We're not going to be so uncharitable. We think the IMF and World Bank definitely does give loans which can be repaid in a long amount of time, but it's not something preferable for a country that's looking for short-term growth and short-term upliftment of its people, especially at a point where they don't have much resources of their own for collateral. At a point, if they do fail a loan at any point, like Pakistan does, then the situation then necessarily becomes that you lose a lot of government institution as like not institution, but like government owned businesses, public businesses like things like railroads, coal, and things like that, which have to go to these foreign lending companies. Then what is the preferred form of income? It is FDI. You want to encourage other companies to come here and invest in your country and therefore put their own money into your own country, because that is the least risky form of development and income for the developing nation. Notice the previous two sources of income, which was interest rates and lending, is a risk for the developing nation, because the developing nation has to pay for the risk at a point where FDI is something to paid for completely by foreign actors. It's a risk on the foreign actors, and it's just the safest way of interest for developing nations. And therefore, that's what we want to prioritize in this debate. Panel, what's the trend in this debate, right? If a few companies come and do well in your country as a developing nation, it sets a precedent and trend for other companies to come and do that as well. It sort of increases the amount of capitalism in the country, which increases the amount of revenue and FDI generated in the country. And that's basically the trend that developing countries want. Is the ideal case, kind of what happened in Singapore, and basically kind of the goal of developing countries to support that and not to oppose that, which would happen if you sort of create a corporate tax. Then I think this comes to our first argument, which is the idea that what is why this is going to be sustainable development if you do not have corporate tax. So look at the first point here. Is the idea it is a signal to other companies that it's something that your country is as a proven marketplace at a point where previous companies have come in here and have done business and have gained profit. They put in the investment and have gotten returns on it. It's a signaling mechanism to other companies in the same field, like sort of more. So if a clothing company comes in and does well, other clothing companies come in. If an automobile maker comes in, then other automobile makers also come in at a point where they want to compete and get access to these markets, which generally have a large amount of middle class and spending power. Then this basically means at a point where also, if you point the fact is a competitive market, because of the fact that they sort of sustain this necessarily, then you get a lot of positivity in terms of FDI and investor confidence. Second point, and this is the flip, where if you have a corporate tax, you disincentivize all of this. At a point where you have a corporate tax, necessarily, then it becomes much more expensive to do business in the country. And these sorts of companies then are disincentivized to come over here, which means you have less FDI. Notice at the point where if you have less FDI, then the alternatives necessarily become things like loans, things like raising interest rates, which are much more harmful for the developing nation. I just want to flag that. But also at a point where if you're decreasing the incentive for the companies to come to your own country, you're increasing the incentives for companies to go to other countries. Look at, so for the example, India in the large part of its post-independence era disincentivized other countries through protectionist policies, and a lot of companies instead went to Southeast Asia, to the Asian tigers, to Singapore, Taiwan, and things like that, and they developed a lot. And India sort of had to were left behind at a point where other these companies set up base in other places, and therefore were able to proliferate and do competition there. The people of those countries benefited a lot. These countries became much more higher in stature and standing in the global scenario, whereas India was left behind. Notice then that even the cases about the African Union and like all of them having the same corporate tax, at a point the company can just evade the African Union and go to the Southeast Asian nations instead, where there is no corporate tax, then we think the harm still stands as a whole anyways. And at the point where if you only getting benefits in GOV, if there's like global collective action, we think necessarily there's a very high burden to prove. They have to show why that's actually going to happen. Then panel, let's look at the comparative, which is protectionism caused by this versus what we actually get on our side, right? We don't necessarily think protectionism is the best way to do this protectionism, because you're disincentivizing foreign companies to come in, and therefore I think the best benefit of government really is just the idea of you're going to protect your local businesses. And why? I'm going to give you a few reasons why this is actually a bad thing. First reason is because of there's a need for to be profitable in the short run, because you need short-term tech and benefits to be able to catch up with the market internationally, to be able to give your own people benefits of modern technology. But secondly, also because it's easier to do business. The fact that you're going to be a global market at that point necessarily, then what happens is the situation becomes your own companies can sort of learn and sort of compete elsewhere. The second point is the idea that your global companies can come in at a point with low corporate taxes and sort of have deals with their own companies. Look at my developing country, India. There's a local company called Maruti. There's a Japanese company called Suzuki, and they have a combined brand, Maruti Suzuki, that sells cars that does very well, because Maruti and Suzuki sort of combine the interest and combine the intellectual property to create cars, and they may do it very well. So local corporations can benefit from this as well. The third point under this is that local corporations then have to like sort of compete with international corporations, and they can, because there necessarily are some companies that can do that. For example, in India itself, Tata Tata, which is a big automobile company, did not have any incentive before 1991 liberalization of the Indian economy to make good amounts of investment into automobiles because there was no competition in the first place. At the point where Hyundai had to come in, at the point where Honda had to come in, Tata also had to improve its cars, and at a point where Tata improved its cars, it improved its revenue, it had to compete, and now it sort of owns Jaguar, it owns other luxury brands. It's done very well for themselves. Tata cars are exported all over the world, so we get the same benefits with regards to exports that open government does. But finally, in terms of small local players, also we think necessarily at the end of the day, they're able to sort of play supplier roles because it's easier for you to just get material from existing sources in the country that imported from outside, and you have local know how to do it easier. For those reasons, it's better for the company itself, and for those reasons, the main impact is we get the revenue, we do it better, both sides opening opposition.
Thank you for that wonderful speech, Leader of Opposition. Now calling on Deputy Prime Minister. Hear.
Cool, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible and visible.
Awesome. I think opening opposition on the surface is pretty correct. The FDI is pretty good for these developing countries. However, FDI by itself is kind of meaningless, right? Like another company comes in, abuses and exploits your workers, takes all of that money and puts it back into their own country to feed their own shareholders. The only way that developing country is able to get an amount of money that they're able to use out of that FDI is if there's a significant corporate tax for them to make money off the company that's exploiting their resources and labor in the status quo. And that is what we get on our side of the house. So yes, lending is a facet of our argument. To the extent that developing countries aren't affected by the corporate tax, we get benefits indirectly through developed countries having the higher corporate tax. That is unresponded to and still exists in this debate broadly overall. So by that in and of itself, if developing countries don't want to opt in, we've already proven a massive benefit that is unique in this debate, whereas the harm only happens if these developing countries opt in on their side of the house. But I'm going to explain why even beyond that, we actually increase FDI. And I just want to make a small strategic note here that the vast majority of the LO speech we just heard is just listing out benefits from FDI, all contingent on the idea that FDI reduces on our side of the house. I'm going to respond to that, flip that, and claim all of those impacting benefits that we hear from LO. But first, a bit of like characterization set up before I get into the clashes, basically. Note, obviously, this is in the interest of developing countries. That is not contested by us of the house. We explain why developing countries specifically require a lot of money for welfare, and lots of individuals in their country aren't necessarily fully trained or aren't necessarily fully employed, but also they need a lot of money, for example, because they're mostly subsistence agriculture in the vast majority of cases, which is in a lot of threat due to changing climates. It requires a lot of agricultural subsidies to keep these farmers that are living on very low margins afloat. So that's why a vast pool of money, specifically in the current era, is pretty important for the developing countries, for the people on the ground. Obviously, opposition can't just show that some developing countries will be worse off. It's a balance of outcomes. We're going to show that the vast majority of developing countries are going to be better off. Let's explain then as to why FDI is better on our side of the house. What we hear from opening opposition is that corporate tax, the only mechanism they have is that having corporate tax will disincentivize companies from coming into those countries, and therefore you lose out on companies being there in the first place. The important thing is that this is not a unilateral corporate tax. So if you are part of the African Union, or if you're part of an economic multilateral agreement in Asia, for example, or Australasia, then you are all as a group, that are the group of people that are trading with each other, that have the free flows of investment and FDI specifically created by the trade agreement, which is the easiest way to have FDI, because all that is codified in that treaty, in that agreement. Now all those countries have that level of corporate tax, so all those countries are able to access that kind of revenue, and companies are unlikely to be able to switch around because there is that global standard of corporate tax. Note that actually that actually solves a massive problem in the status quo, which again unresponded to from our prime minister, which is the race to the bottom, where everyone has to compete against each other to be slightly more attractive to those companies, which means that all countries have a low corporate tax and companies can still go anywhere. So you actually lose out on any corporate competitive advantage by having that corporate tax as low as you have it in the status quo, and you just lose out on money. That solves that common collective action problem in order to get the corporate tax up there. We've also explained far more and needs more response, and hopefully we'll cater to whatever whatever closing opposition brings up, that we have the internal checking mechanisms, or rather why in the status quo, you have a risk of corporate tax going low because of all the corporate capture material, and why we provide a huge cost of leaving multilateral agreements and free trade that aligns the incentives of some companies, like the companies that benefit from the free trade of the multilateral agreement, to not want to leave that, but also the people on the ground who will be harmed if all the prices of their products go down, which imposes a huge political cost on reducing the corporate tax because you have to leave the agreement, which means that most of those countries are likely to stay, and it's going to be a relatively sustainable revenue stream for all of those countries. What do they say kind of preemptively in response to this? They're like, oh, well, if it's all in African Union, they'll evade it and go to Asia. But note the scope of this motion, right? It's a rather weirdly framed motion, which is that it's in the interest of developing countries to support, so we'd like to happen, the BEP being set up in all multilateral agreements that currently exist. The info slide seems to suggest mostly rich countries, right, with G20, G8, and the OECD. And that's catered to in our first argument about lending that hasn't been responded to, where the benefits trickle down to developing countries, and there is no harm really to developing countries. There's actually a benefit there, right? Because if developed countries that have the ability to lower corporate tax now have to have a high corporate tax, that actually enhances the competitive advantage of all developing countries that don't have that corporate tax, because they are able to now compete on like cheaper labor and cheaper land in those areas and have a low corporate tax, whereas all the developed countries now have a high corporate tax. And that stops countries like Ireland, for example, because they don't require that revenue as much because they're developed, from just lowering their corporate tax to the bottom and being basically a tax haven for countries in the EU and in the West, which harms a lot of other poorer countries in the EU, like Greece, for example. So those kinds of things are also uniquely solved and asked of the House. They can't just move from the African Union to Asia, because A, they obviously have region-specific products that they're providing to a specific region. So it's hard to shift to a different area that's doing different products and different natural resources, for example. But there are also existing companies in Asia to compete with, whereas you're the company in Africa that has all the control, or most of the control and market power there. So why would you go compete against a company that's already established? But also you just lose the African market. If all the countries move from the AU, then there's a huge amount of profit that can be made from Africa, even if there's a corporate tax. So there's obviously an incentive for companies to set up there. All those benefits are then standing on our side of the House. Before I move on, I'll take a point from closing opposition. I'm going to cut you off here because the premise is completely wrong, right? We're not only talking about the World Bank and the IMF, given that they have more money, the IMF makes those decisions. So as a percentage of GDP is obviously affected by the amount of revenue that the government is able to get in terms of the deficit spending, right? But even beyond that, countries are actually the largest lenders to other countries. So that's why you get the benefit from other countries lending to each other. But even the IMF is actually much better than it was, right? Look at what they've done to Sri Lanka and Argentina. I'm also from a developing country, and you can see the effects that that kind of lending has. Let's talk about why corporate tax is good and extend a little bit more here, because we had very minimal response completely to our entire case. But it's also important to remove that race to the bottom, because it's actually bad for developing countries that do that race to the bottom and become tax havens, for example, because the entire economy, look at Panama, look at other kinds of tax havens, are entirely around hosting those companies. And the jobs are given to the most privileged, or they hire people from overseas to do the very high level accounting and banking stuff. And it's hard to diversify that because there's very low government revenue because there's no tax, but also government attention is being a tax haven, which means that all the other people in that country live in really bad conditions, have no way to work and earn money to actually improve their conditions, and have that loss of like purpose and identity. That's insane. And we want to develop that country specifically and not make it reliant on having low taxes, because that might help some people that are exploited by the MNCs that come in. It might help the rich people that are able to make deals with those MNCs, but it doesn't help people develop. It doesn't give them the training. It doesn't give them the welfare that they require. We need that money. This corporate tax is just a no-brainer.
Thank you for that wonderful speech, Deputy Prime Minister. And now to conclude the clash for opening, calling on Deputy Leader of OP here.
Hi, is this visible and audible?
Yes, you're both visible and audible.
Fantastic. Just give me a second. POI is exclusively in the chat box. Please do not unmute yourself. I'll take one from closing for sure. All right. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. opening government case is based on the inherent assumption that all the countries within this bloc are going to be on an equal level when it comes to the economies of these countries. This assumption is wrong insofar as most of these countries have really different ways in which they not only get tax money, but also overall revenue that they end up generating, which should suggest that within these blocks as well, there are going to be far poorer countries and far richer countries. Insofar as this exists, having a singular taxation like statement existing across all of these countries or the entire bloc is just going to harm the smaller developing countries far more. That's our case, and we're just going to win on that. The first thing I just want to note is that the nature of this corporate taxation in and of itself is just not great for most developed countries, developing countries already. Why is this true? I think firstly, within these blocks, most of the countries that exist want competitive benefits that can exist within these blocks, which is to say that even though they end up supporting each other, they still compete against each other. This still looks like within the ASEAN countries within the ASEAN as well compete against each other in terms of generating or securing overall economic revenue as well, which means that most of these countries still have incentives to either A, try and safeguard themselves, but also to make sure that they push other countries down insofar as that leads to comparative benefits of you having more money in your own pockets. Secondly, we think that even within these countries, there are differential standards of money. You can't have a one size fits all rule in this particular case, insofar as most of these countries are incredibly diverse in nature, not only in the ways in which they generate money. So, a certain economy can be much more primary in nature, but the other economy can be secondary in nature or tertiary in nature. This looks like even within like blocks like ASEAN or blocks like Europe, like the European Union and stuff like that. Not all of these countries have the same economic resources or the same like backgrounds to like base their economies off of, which is to suggest that most of these countries need differential standards to be able to tax themselves accordingly. So you need the flexibility to exist in the first place. So this is the first attack that ends up coming from opening government, where they suggest that look, yeah, now you're going to become a tax haven. The possibility of that even happening exists far more on their side of the house. This is for a couple of reasons. Firstly, on their side, there's far lesser flexibility insofar as you don't exactly control the ways in which the corporate taxation happens, because this motion is about extending it across all the nations within a particular economic bloc, which specifically means on their side of the house, there's far lesser flexibility in terms of just dictating what your own economy is going to look like, which means that you don't exactly suggest whether or not you want to become a tax haven in the first place. But the second thing to note is that when you don't get to dictate this, you're often going to be pushed or strong out by other countries surrounding you, insofar as they also want the competitive benefits or competitive advantages of not only their own companies trying to get as much money out of you as possible, but also companies just like exploiting you in general. Okay, the second problem with this is that the only incentive that you can actually provide to a lot of these companies in general is to decrease some of your corporate taxation, insofar as this leads to more like companies coming to your country. I think the first thing to just note is that fixed costs are a huge problem, and they're probably the highest cost that a company actually ends up bearing. This means that a lot of the companies that end up bearing costs, like the biggest brunt of their cost is usually the fixed cost of taxation or tariffs and stuff like that. But secondly, we think that labor and other things are also incredibly expensive, labor, machinery, etc. Which means that the best way in which you can incentivize countries to in fact come to your country and actually end up investing there is by decreasing some of this corporate taxation. Note, this means two things. Firstly, we think that most of these countries are likely to do this rather strategically, as opposed to OG just suggesting that you do one size fits all. You're not going to do this stupidly, where you just decrease the corporate taxation to like 1% and then just have all of the companies come and fuck you over. But the second thing to just note is that you, at the point of time, you have incredibly high corporate taxation rates that are more likely to exist on OG. We think that this not only disincentivizes most companies to come in, because this decreases the amount of growth that a company can actually have within this country. Insofar as if the company grows, then the corporate taxation that this company also has to go through also grows, which means that the amount of net profit that you can end up generating is just far lesser on side OG. Let's then talk about long-term effects and why they're far better on our side of the house. Firstly, Archit already tells you about the signaling effect that happens point of time, you're a proven market that's much safer for the rest of the world. Insofar as even if you have fluctuations that end up happening within these countries, you're still like the barrier of investment is just far lesser. Insofar as the corporate taxation that you have to end up incurring is just far lesser. Secondly, we think that collaboration with other local companies that ends up happening due to the coming of these like foreign companies is just far better, because a lot of these local companies end up benefiting from the tech that the larger companies have, or the market that is shared. This looks like Maruti Suzuki ending up like becoming like a huge thing within India or within the automobile industry in India, where Suzuki collaborated with Maruti and ended up like diversifying the market and just increasing the market portfolio. Before I continue to the third and fourth reason, closing off.
Under your side, countries don't have the ability to decrease corporate tax because their companies will always offshore their profits to places like Switzerland and Delaware. We give them that ability.
It's very wrong, because for all of this to stand, you have to prove why these larger companies have, larger countries have incentives to even cater to the smaller countries, which is to suggest that you're like this attack only ever stands at the point of time you prove that like a country like Switzerland would even care about a country like, let's say, India, which is to suggest that you need this added amount of flexibility on our side to make sure that you can protect yourself far better. The third thing to this note is that more competition is likely to exist on our side of the house, insofar as more companies can end up coming to your place. Note, this is the second attack that ends up coming from DPM, where they suggest that if everyone just has low taxation rates, then you're just competing with everyone in the fucking pool. We think that this is still far better than having higher corporate taxation rates, because one, there are multitudes of companies that already exist. So sure, certain countries might lose out for certain companies, but other countries might want to invest in the country itself, insofar as you probably get the resources that you wanted for the company to continue to persist. Which is to suggest that probably Suzuki does not invest in, let's say, a country like Japan, but it still invests in a country like India, insofar as Suzuki gets the natural mineral resources that it wanted in the first place. Note that this is crucial, because this means that we expand the scope within this debate, insofar as we allow more companies to try and to come in and invest into our country, which means that you just give them more jobs, which means that you just give people more jobs, or people like the country just way far more money, which means that we have more money on our hands, and that's a benefit. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful speech. Now to open the flash on closing, calling on member of government here.
We agree at closing government that corporate tax is good. The problem is you don't get corporate tax if you don't attract companies at all, or you attract far less because you remove your competitive advantage, which is what the opposition claims happens in their best case. We're going to engage with this best case and prove that, firstly, we increase the capacity to collect corporate taxes as a developing country when you opt into these agreements. But secondly, we're going to uniquely prove that we enable developing countries to keep and increase their competitive advantage over developed countries at the point that the developed countries were more likely to opt into these agreements because they're more likely to be into multilateral agreements, amongst other reasons. So therefore, we've been on the metrics of both FDI and collecting more corporate tax. So the first thing I'm going to explain in this speech is how we enable developing countries to gain a competitive advantage because they're going to be less inclined to opt in to these BEPs. Supporting BEPs, importantly, doesn't mean poor countries have to opt in, and the act of developing countries supporting them can simply mean they support richer countries. I forget if I said that correctly, but the act of developing countries supporting them means they don't need to support opting into them themselves. They can also just support rich countries opting in because we're just supporting their general existence. So the problem in the status quo that we highlight in a POI is that sure, companies might offshore their factories to your country, but they're always going to be more inclined to put their headquarters and all of their profits in places like Ireland and Switzerland, tax havens in the rich world, for the reason that they have greater stability, have greater infrastructure. They just feel safer there. So you don't get any of their benefits of being able to tax them in their world, because all the place where it's headquartered and therefore where it's taxed is in the developing world. What we're going to prove, the developed world, it's so confusing. What we're going to prove is that poor countries are less likely to opt in, and so they're able to gain a competitive advantage over Western tax havens. Why are developing countries less likely to opt in to these agreements? Firstly, I think the act of supporting it doesn't mean they have to opt in, so they can opt out of the BEPs if it's strategic to them, which we think in some instances it will be. But secondly, they can only opt into specific ones, which I think are ones in like regional alliances, noting that people like these countries are more likely to be in regional alliances anyway, because you're more likely to align with your neighbors. What that looks like then is places like, for example, African countries collectively like entering into a BEP for their multilateral agreement and collectively agreeing to set the corporate tax rate at a fixed price, but like lower than, for example, what Western countries would set it at, because it's all in their collective interest. So in that way, you're more able to maintain your competitive advantage. The third reason they're less likely to opt in is being in a multilateral agreement is a prerequisite to entering into a BEP. And I just posit that developing countries are far less likely to be in multilateral agreements to begin with. First, intuitively, look at the info slide, which lists things like the G8. Like, I don't know who's in the G8, but it sounds like a lot of powerful countries, probably not developing countries in there. So I think like we're talking about like prestigious multilateral agreements that are unlikely to have developing countries in there. Secondly, I think there's just democratic incentives to do what's right. And I think, maybe there's a big incentive comparatively in the EU for things like regulation and greater corporate tax, but I don't think that exists at the point people know, like value FDI in the developed world, so they're less likely to opt into these multilateral agreements through voting and pressure their governments to do so. So therefore, you're less likely to be in the multilateral agreement. Thirdly, I think rich countries don't want to be in multilateral agreements with poor countries a lot of the time for the reason that they're often unstable, that they are comparatively more likely, I suppose, to be like dictatorships or authoritarian democracies, which means that there's like a voting incentive, an electoral incentive in the developed world to not be in alliances and agreements with people they perceive are bad. So what we prove then is poor countries are less likely to opt in, whereas comparatively rich companies are pressured by their comparatively more pro-regulation populace and the fact that they're in more multilateral agreements to enter into them, which means the rich world, tax havens in the rich world like Ireland and Switzerland have to increase their tax rate, so they don't have that competitive advantage over poor countries. So instead, companies are forced to put their HQ in the developing world and gain benefits from, they are able to gain benefits because they can increase their competitive advantage over rich countries because they can set a low corporate tax or not opt in and have any corporate tax at all. So yeah. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from closing. Yeah, for the reasons I gave, but even if you don't believe that, we have independent reasons why we win. Okay, the next thing I'm going to explain, and this is our second extension, is that even if developing countries do opt into these agreements, you're still able to attract more FDI than on the comparative. That's because even if all countries are in these agreements and vow to implement corporate tax, that doesn't necessarily mean that it translates into doing it all the time. Developing countries maintain their advantage, we believe, because they necessarily have weaker governments and weak regulatory frameworks, which means it's easier for companies to tax evade, or at least companies perceive that it is easier for them to tax evade at the point they're in a developing country. So crucially, you're still able to collect corporate tax when you enter into these agreements as a developing country, certainly more than the status quo when you're not part of these agreements and probably don't have any corporate tax, but you still are able to tax people comparatively less, but you still are able to tax people comparatively less. Therefore, you are far more attractive to companies than developed countries, even if everyone is in these BEP agreements, because you have a weaker regulatory framework. So countries think they're more able to tax evade. Note the weighing on this. Even if corporate tax is low, because companies sometimes tax evade, you still get more money if you attract lots of corporations with the promise of tax evasions and take a low amount of tax for them. Whereas the comparative is you get less companies coming in, if any, given that they probably go to the developed world for stability, for better contract enforcement, etc., or all other things being equal. So yeah, you're able to, it's better to not, in their world, they don't get any companies or they get minimal companies, so that high tax rate is beneficial. You're able to make way more money by taxing a lot of companies with a low tax rate. All of this suggests we get more FDI and win on OO's metric, but we're also able to get comparatively more corporate tax. So we win on both teams' metrics. For that reason, clear CG win.
Thank you for that wonderful speech, Member of Government. Now calling on Member of Opposition. Here.
Cool, just checking that I'm all audible and visible.
You're both audible and visible.
Perfect. My POI preference is for either visually or in the chat. I think the first problem for closing government and their extension in today's debate is that obviously as a developing country, you did actually have to opt into BEPS to get any of the benefits that they wanted to claim about having higher tax rates, which allowed you to increase the tax take and reinvest in your communities and those types of things. I think if you just sat out of it, if you remained under the status quo, part of the collective action problem, which they never solve if you say, oh, we can just sit on the sidelines, that was a zero delta in today's debate. But I think the second problem that they've run into is this bizarre characterization that somehow Switzerland will opt into these agreements, will turn away from this entire model that they've been pursuing for a very long time because they are a democracy, something that they notably have been for the entire time that they've developed as a tax haven. That wasn't a realistic characterization of the way this is going to work. 3 extensions then. 1, why you have to opt in as a developing country. 2nd, why this reduces multilateralism and why that's terrible. Finally, why this decreases the government revenue in developing countries. Starting off on why you have to opt in, because OO don't actually prove that you were coerced into it, but it is required for the benefits. The motion is not about opting in as an individual developing country. It is about just the advent of them. 1, you do have to opt in because you're part of these agreements. There's a degree of path dependency. The fact that these are discussing you get benefits from being in the agreements, that's particularly good. Secondly, I would say that for developing countries, these agreements and these regional blocks are something that are disproportionately important because individually they are small. They are not like the US and China. They can go out on their own and do things individually because of their sheer size. The fact that they were individually quite small mean that they needed to coalesce in that way. Thirdly, I think you face sanctions or punishment if you do not comply with what happens in your bloc. It is the same way that in the EU, if you transgress a lot of those things, that means that you get fined or you get other sort of punishments or not you limit the benefits of membership. But finally, I think rich countries want to bash you into it because they have an interest in doing it. The West will only support this type of regulation if it is sweeping, if it is broad opt-in. They don't want to be the ones who are single-handedly raising their tax rates and left out to dry. I now want to deal with the strange CG claim that Patrick points out at POI that countries do not get into agreements with countries that are different from them economically. I've identified about 8 which have developed and developing countries in it. The EU, Eastern European debaters love to tell us that Eastern Europe is developing, so I think that's pretty important. Secondly, obviously the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, the African Union. Just because it had African in the name didn't mean that all the countries in this were absolute backwaters. Places like ASEAN, agreements like NAFTA, agreements like the TTPA meant that there were was a wide variety of countries opting in with this. Why is this coercing into opting in particularly important? Because it deals with the CG's ability to oh, you can just sit at the sidelines and not get any benefits, not get any harms. We tell you that you are forced into it in a way that is coercive, in a way that is neocolonial, and in a way that is an independent, principled harm that should be credited to closing opposition. But also this unlocks all of opening opposition's harms, right? Because it is quite easy to say that, oh, if these agreements are so bad, you can just sit on the sideline. We prove that is not possible. But I think the thing I would observe at the end of this is that even if opt-in is very, very high across the developing world, as I show you, it is unlikely to be perfect. There are going to be a couple of countries, where that is Switzerland, where that is Mauritius and stuff, who do sit on the sidelines because they are tax havens, which means that all those, you just concentrate all the tax revenue into those countries and you leave those the vast majority of developing countries, which you probably should care about in this action debate, out to dry. Second extension, why this reduces multilateralism. The first premise is quite simple. Developing countries need multilateralism. They're small individually. They need to coalesce. They need to do things like coalition building. Regional identities are often particularly important in these contexts. And finally, often these institutions, places like the WTO, do have more of a reparation remit now in terms of correcting the wrongs of colonization and all those types of things. Second thing to say is that often the this BEPS regulation can be quite unpopular through many members of these developing countries. One, because there's corporate lobbying. Citizens United in the US means that the corporate capture is very entrenched. Obviously, these corporations do not want increased taxation regulation. Secondly, there are swings and roundabouts in politics that means that right-wingers are going to get in eventually. And thirdly, a lot of people are ideologically opposed to this type of regulation, whether that's because they like low taxes, or whether that's because they hate multilateralism and they want sovereignty to be able to make their own decisions. Why does this make multilateralism worse in a way that is devastating for government bench? One, I think it's incredibly likely in certain instances that certain actors consider or actually act on pulling out of these agreements because they do not want to be coerced into a Western kind of BEPS policy that is necessarily imposed on them in an incredibly bad way. Obviously, this can happen in a variety of scales. It is not the claim of CO that the African Union completely collapses. It is just the fact that it is much less disempowered. Secondly, I think it's likely to result in conflict within these forums because these agreements are highly technical, because they take the other things off the table when you're constantly discussing tax policy for the next 40 years. There is an agreement, there is a reason that these agreements have not been reached and have not been adopted. That is because they are contentious, they are technical, and they suck life out of other things that could be used to be discussing things like climate change, things like trade policy, things that actually meaningfully benefit people's lives. The third thing I would suggest is that you're likely to want to disempower these institutions in future if they've implemented these things. They're very contingent on Western support often. This is inflamed at the point at which you get a Trump presidency, right? But now he's it's the IMF is not just bad for all the other reasons, it's also bad because they want high taxes, and that's bad. This affects literally everything else in the debate, not just tax policy, things like climate change, things like defense, things like trade policy, things like human rights, which are all devastated by government bench. OG.
So OO says that pulling out actually increases your competitive advantage, and you're saying that you lose out on free trade. Why not let some of these countries that might make that choice, while most countries will stay for the defense and security and climate change benefits, and all of them will have increased corporate revenue?
The problem with that POI is that if countries do not opt in and are not pushed to opt in, the government bench does not get any of the benefits in terms of being able to increase those tax revenue and stuff. But I think the second thing to say is that with it, you need homogeneity within that multilateral bloc, right? Because if you do have the info slide suggests that all people within this bloc have to opt in a way that's particularly important. If you do have disagreement, that is likely lead to things like fracturing, or likely leads to things like disempowerment and arguments that are incredibly bad for these developing countries. Final extension, why this decreases the government revenue in developing countries. I think the first thing just to observe is often once you've entered into these agreements, there are things like quite punitive punishment clauses, which are if you transgress and if you lower your corporate tax rate, which often does happen in these developing countries when authoritarian leaders or strongmen come to power. That means that you are likely to face things like sanctions from other countries, which directly reduce the standard of living of your individual population, or restrict your ability to respond to exogenous shocks like COVID in a particularly bad way. I finally would just suggest that this reduces the tax take because you don't get those MNCs going in and opting into that tax system when you do not do that. So proud to stand in closing opposition.
Thank you for that wonderful speech. And now to close the case for government bench, calling on government whip, here.
Well, just confirming I can be heard. Can I be heard?
Yes, you're audible.
Perfect. Thank you. Just give me 1 sec. The problem with the closing opposition case is while it might sound very nice and sound very principled, it is incredibly uncomparative. Does not at all reference what happens to these developing nations under the status quo, where they are coerced by colonialist powers, where they still cannot control their own tax policies because rich countries in the West can set their corporate tax to 0% or 0.5%, which means you cannot control your own tax policy and you're still beholden to foreign powers. That is the problem that we solve under closing government when we point out the increased ability for developing nations to control their own taxation policy, to, if they want to, opt into lower lower corporate tax rate than the developed world so that they can reap the benefits of increased foreign direct investment. And we explain that in a far, far clearer way than opening government does. Three things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to rebuild our extension and explain why it gets over opening government. Then I'm going to explain closing opposition, and lastly, opening opposition. So let's rebuild our extension. The first thing we do is prove that developing nations are likely to opt out of BEPS. Note that this is something that opening government does not do and are required to do if they want to try and co-opt the benefits that we talk about. Because this is a This House supports motion, they don't have fiat to do that. And we explain the reasons why developing countries are likely to opt out of that. And I'll get into CO's responses when I deal with them later. But what I want to add here is that there's a huge burden to adding this to your multilateral agreement because it requires a huge amount of regulatory oversight. It requires you to be able to go into countries and make sure that they are collecting on that corporate tax. It is also a huge imposition on your national sovereignty, which means it is only in the most developed nations and most developed multilateral agreements where this is going to be asked for. And that is why the info slide talks about, for example, the G8, the OECD. If those places is where there's impetus to implement these types of agreements because they are developed countries or more developed countries than the rest of the world, and they have the ability and regulatory oversight to implement this. The types of developing countries we are talking about on our side are the developing countries that are the worst off developing countries that do not have the ability to control their own corporate tax rates, do not have the ability to attract foreign direct investment because all of those profits are offshored. Then we explain, and it adds on to what happened in Zoe's speech, why this is a crucial tipping point. Because there are competing reasons to put your headquarters and operations in the developed world because you have a more secure legal system, you have democratic stability, and there are more reasons to put it in the developing world, which is they are closer to the actual production, which means it's more efficient, you have lower labor costs, you have lower cost of building your buildings and headquarters and operations, etc., which means it is cheaper. The reason we win this trade-off is because we put all of the profit reasons on one side. We now say you can go to a developing nation, which either has a lower tax rate than the developed world because they're not part of these agreements, or even if they are part of these agreements and have the same tax rate, it is easier for companies to dodge this tax or find loopholes in the developing world, which still provides them a financial incentive to go to the developing world, which means we put all of the profit reasons on one side and therefore hugely incentivize them to increase the amount of operations and building that they do in the developing world. That leads to huge benefits, things like jobs, infrastructure, and leads to the benefits of corporate tax that opening government want to talk about. Because, for example, the more FDI and the more operations you have operating in your country, the more corporate tax is flowing because you have more operations to tax. Closing opposition says, well, you have to opt into BEPS to get the benefits. No, because now you're no longer competing with the developed world, and that is how I explain those incentives to put countries in the developed world and how you overcome those now. But now you're only competing against other nations in the developing world, which is obviously far better. That's far more fair for you to compete in those types of instances. Let's weigh this against opening government. Their case is on the benefits of corporate tax. Two things to say here. Firstly, we compete with the reality that poor countries will not join these unions, or that their unions that they are joined will not implement this agreement, noting that this is a This House supports debate, and as opening opposition says, they want these competitive benefits. Secondly, they say why they unify corporate tax, but they don't explain why the unification of corporate tax leads to companies operating more in the developed world. There's a missing link in the chain of logic. So we are the ones that actually prove that benefit manifests, prove that companies are more likely to go to the developing world, are more likely to therefore implement FDI, build more infrastructure, and therefore we claim those benefits of foreign direct investment. And note the scale of that foreign direct investment outpaces the amount of government lending and government loaning because companies are private, have more money to invest in the economy. And also if governments are corrupt or incompetent, like is often the case in the developing world in some states, the FDI caters to the interests of the people far more than any sort of lending that is taken on by the government. So that means we take it over opening government in that instance. Let's then talk about closing opposition. The first question here, and this kind of responds to our extension, is, are developing nations forced to opt in? Firstly, no, because it requires huge amounts of regulatory oversight. It's not going to be in most agreements. It is likely to be something that happens relatively sparingly among countries where there's huge democratic push to do this sort of thing. So for example, the United States wanting to trade with countries in the Eurozone makes them more likely to call for like Ireland, for example, to increase its corporate tax. And that is incredibly important in terms of The developed world has democratic incentives to implement this. They also want to take part in the international community more and be seen as good international players and join these multilateral agreements with the rich players, which means they're more likely to join the types of unions that implement this policy in the first place. I'll take opening.
You are incredibly uncharitable in your case because this motion only ever happens when the developing country has opted into the economic bloc. We explained why that's a huge harm when you have a corporate tax that is uniform in nature.
No, that's a
Engage with
false
us.
premise. This debate does not happen when the developing nation opts into this economic bloc. This debate is about a developing nation supporting the existence of these types of agreements in the first place. And we explain uniquely at Closing Government why these agreements almost always happen in the developed world and therefore the benefits accrue to the developing nations. We say further in response to Closing Opposition that developing nations are more likely to be beholden. Developed nations are more likely to be beholden to imports and trade from developing nations. They are the ones that benefit from these free trade agreements because they get lower labor costs. They get cheaper goods imported into their countries, which means they have greater democratic return because people in there get lower costs of goods, which is obviously good in terms of the current inflation crisis, which means they are not going to want to implement these things if it leads to the risk of developing nations pulling out of multilateral free trade agreements. And lastly, as is pointed out by in a POI, we give them the choice to opt out of this, the choice to control their own taxation policy, which is far more beneficial. Lastly, Closing Opposition says, well, multilateralism becomes worse. But if you choose to pull out, that is fine. But they won't because the developed nations want to cater to the developing nations. Lastly, as I said in my introduction, this is incredibly uncomparative. They are still coerced by free trade agreements under Closing Opposition's world. They are still coerced into bad trade agreements. You still have neocolonialism because you cannot control your own taxation policy. If they care about principles, we are the ones that fulfill it. So proud to propose.